Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome to a new video. Now today I want to do something a little bit different. Both myself and other YouTubers have pretty much been bombarding you with new rune ideas, theory crafting of certain OP trends in Preseason 8, and it's just really been all over the place. I know for my channel specifically, I've done like 4 different rune ideas for Lee Sin and a few build ideas, and I guess I wanted to just dedicate today's video to really bringing it all together and giving you my advice for Lee Sin in Preseason 8, and which runes are actually good and for what situations, and just summarize the past 2 weeks of videos. So the main thing I want to talk about today are the Lee Sin runes, what runes are viable for the upcoming season, and which runes are the best for Lee Sin. Before I tell you my preferred runes, I want to go over all possible options and talk about the rune ideas I've made videos on. The first rune idea I had for Lee Sin was the Predator Lee Sin rune. If you aren't familiar with Predator, it adds an active to your boots that gives you a bunch of movement speed and an on-hit effect on your next ability or auto attack. It's really good for flanking junglers like Hecarim and Rammus, but I tried it on Lee Sin and it was an absolute blast. Now, I'm going to be honest, despite my personal enjoyment, Predator Lee Sin is not something I recommend in almost any situation when it comes to trying to win in ranked. It doesn't benefit Lee Sin nearly as much as the other runes, so I don't recommend this rune unless you're trying to just have fun in normals. For those of you wanting to try it, this is what I would recommend taking. So obviously the keystone that you'll take is Predator. Like I said, it adds an active to your boots that gives you like a ghost type cooldown. And it gives you an on-hit effect. After that, I would take Sudden Impact. I think it just synergizes well with, you know, your W on Lee Sin, ward hopping. For the third one, I would take Eyeball Collection. I just think that with Predator, you're already going to be all over the map. You're going to be super active, so taking Eyeball Collection gives you a little bit of snowball, extra snowball, I should say. So I would definitely recommend taking that. And then lastly, Ingenious Hunter. This makes unique takedowns lower the cooldown of all your actives, and that includes your enchant on Predator. So it gives you much shorter Predator cooldowns. In a secondary tree, I would go Sorcery, and this is what you'll do for every Lee Sin page. If you're not taking Sorcery as your primary, you'll always take Sorcery as your secondary. There's just too much utility in there that benefits Lee Sin. Now, because you're taking Predator, which is all about that movement speed, why not just go Celerity and Water Walking, 2 movement runes that, you know, I think will just synergize well with what you're trying to do. Like I said, this rune page, not very viable in a ranked setting. Unless if you're really snowballing, it really just does nothing for you. It's really fun though, so take it in normals and try it out. Alright, so the next rune that I tried out on Lee Sin was Dark Harvest. And if you're not familiar with Dark Harvest, what that does is anytime you kill a large minion, or a large monster, a cannon minion, or an enemy champion, you get a certain amount of soul essence, and that'll continuously stack throughout the game, kind of like a Nasus Q, so that at the end of the game, you're actually on your next auto attack doing bonus damage, bonus 80 adaptive damage, and it basically gave Lee Sin a way to scale to the late game, which is something that you don't have on Lee Sin typically, and that's why I really liked it, and I think it was really interesting and a lot of fun to try it out. My honest opinion about the rune in hindsight though is, why would you pick the rune that's best for the late game when you're on an early game champion? Like, yeah, you can argue like, well, your early game is good enough with or without like any other rune, so, you know, this gives you a late game, and I agree that in certain situations that's actually really smart. But I would argue that in most situations, Dark Harvest is not the ideal rune for Lee Sin. The only situations I can really think of where this would be important is when you have a team that, like, you literally have no gank potential for in the early game, just a horrible laning phase, and you're going up against another team who also doesn't have a very good early game. Therefore, you don't really need the early game because it's just not going to really benefit you as much, and you would want to scale into the late game a little bit. I could see that being a time when you would want to take Dark Harvest. Basically, your team scaling, the other team isn't a threat early, so go ahead and take Dark Harvest and scale. But outside of that, I don't think Dark Harvest is the best rune, but if you do want to take Dark Harvest, if you like it, or if you're in that situation that I just described, you'll also want to take Sudden Impact. I just think this is the best one for Lee Sin, the most consistent. Eyeball Collection, same thing. I just think it's the most consistent rune for Lee Sin. And the only difference is the Relentless Hunter instead of the Ingenious Hunter, because I just think out of combat movement speed will get you from camp to camp faster, get you lane to lane faster, allow you to build those stacks quicker. In the Sorcery tree, this is your secondary tree. I would take Transcendence. I think this rune is just so good on Lee Sin, on really anyone. I love CDR, and on Lee Sin it's really good. And the second rune that I take in the secondary tree is Gathering Storm. I think this one synergizes well with Dark Harvest. It has another element of scaling in it. The later the game goes, the more AD adaptive you get, which, like I said, that's the reason why you'd want to take Dark Harvest in the first place, because you think the game might go a little bit longer. So this is the rune page that I take if I'm doing Dark Harvest. This is what I would recommend. Again, though, not my first choice for Lee Sin. Alright, and then that leaves the third and final option in the Domination tree, which is Electrocute. If you're not familiar with Electrocute, it's basically Season 7's or Season 8's version of Thunderlord's Decree. It after hitting a champion with 3 separate abilities or attacks, you do bonus damage, and the damage I've noticed is a little bit higher, I think, than previous seasons, but the cooldown is also higher than Thunderlord's Decree was last season, so it's a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same. This is actually the rune that I would recommend in like most situations for Lee Sin. This is my preferred rune page. This is what I would recommend to you to use. If you're not sure, if you want to stick to one rune page, this is the one to do. I think it's the most consistent and it synergizes the best with Lee Sin's kit. I think the other ones have some good stuff in them, but I think nothing's ever going to be as consistently viable as Electrocute. Same thing for the rest. Sudden Impact, Eyeball Collection. You can take Ravenous Hunter or Relentless Hunter, or you can really even take this too if you want. Really, all three of them are just as good in my opinion. I probably will take Ravenous Hunter just for a little bit of extra damage, or a little bit of lifesteal, since I like to build damage Lee Sin. It doesn't really matter. And then in the Sorcery tree, definitely take Transcendence as one of them. And the second one, it kind of depends on the situation. I take Nullifying Orb if I'm going up against a heavy AP comp, or if I'm going up against an AP jungler, and that'll help me in those dueling in the jungles if I try to invade, or if they try to invade me. The Nullifying Orb is just a little added shield for you to try and win those duels. But if you're not really going up against any AP, then obviously you won't want to take that. You can take the Ultimate Hat instead, which reduces the cooldown on your ult every time you use it. Obviously that's pretty good on Lee, or you can just go with Gathering Storm and try and have a little bit of scaling. Really is up to you, but just make sure Transcendence is one of them, because I think that rune is just really good on Lee. So yeah, this is the rune page right here that I would recommend you take if you only want to do one rune page for Lee. This is the page right here that I would recommend to you. So that wraps up all of the runes that you can take in the Domination tree. There are other options that you can do. One of the videos that I made was about Grasp of the Undying Lee Sin, which is in the Resolve tree. That's what you see here. Grasp of the Undying. Every 4 seconds in combat, your next basic attack on a champion will deal bonus magic damage equal to 4% of their health and heal you for 2% of their max health, just like the old Grasp. But on top of that, it also permanently increases your health by 5. Again, this is a tank rune. It's not the best option for the early game, but if you really need a tank and you want a little bit better late game, then this is an option that you can take. You'll also take Font of Life, Conditioning, and then Overgrowth. Again, this is more scaling into the late game, makes you tankier. And then in the Sorcery tree, or I'm sorry, in the secondary tree, you'll take Sorcery once again. That doesn't change. Now, I do want to say that so far from what I've noticed, Season 8, being tanky on Lee Sin isn't that helpful. Like in other seasons, if you went tanky Lee Sin, you could actually be a viable frontliner at the end of the game, and you could be pretty hard for the backline to take down. But with the runes that are out right now and the items, the strength that they are now, 80 carries in the late game do not care about how tanky you are. It doesn't matter how many tank items you build. You will get shredded as Lee Sin in the late game. So I personally have been swaying away from Grasp of the Undying Lee Sin in almost all situations. There's just always going to be a better rune than Grasp of the Undying in pretty much anything in the tank tree for Lee Sin. So while I did have some decent results playing it, and I think it is a viable option, I don't recommend it. I think it's kind of a waste of your early game, and like I said, you're gonna get cut through like paper regardless of how tanky you are on Lee Sin at the end of the game. There's just too many strong offensive runes. So unless if you really enjoy playing tank Lee Sin, shy away from this tree. But if you do like tank Lee Sin, this is an option for you, and you can see it right here. Alright, so moving on to the third and final tree that you can realistically take. It's the Sorcery tree as your primary, and there's really two runes in here that I could see working, Summon Aerie being one of them, and the other being Phase Rush, which I haven't tried for a video. It's basically the old Storm Raider Surge being brought back, and I personally don't like that. It's not my cup of tea, but if you liked Storm Raider Surge, I've heard that a lot of Lee Sins have had success with that, so Phase Rush is an option. But I'm going to talk about Summon Aerie because there's something very interesting about this rune on Lee Sin that I think is worth mentioning, and I did mention it in my video about this rune, is that when you apply your Sonic Wave onto a target, Summon Aerie does its damage, it gets summoned, and if you wait 2 to 3 seconds before using a Resonating Strike, the Summon Aerie will have done its damage, and then you can use Resonating Strike and it'll reapply Aerie. So you get 2 procs of Summon Aerie with 1 Q basically, and I think that's something that I think is actually pretty strong when you think about it. On top of that, Summon Aerie also works with your W, so you get to use it on allies as well, and that'll give them an extra shield. Obviously, for the rest of the tree, I take Nullifying Orb, Transcendence. Nullifying Orb can be switched out with the Ultimate Hat if you don't need it. And then for the last one, I take Scorch because I think it does synergize with Summon Aerie, but it does such little amount of damage that I almost want to say just go Gathering Storm. It just is better. So I'll leave that one up to you, whatever you think is better. It really doesn't matter. And then in the secondary tree, because you're already using Sorcery, the secondary tree is kind of up in the air. Do you take Domination? Do you take Resolve? Do you take Precision? I think it doesn't really matter. I haven't played it enough to really know what's better for the secondary tree. I like the way Precision looks, getting the extra tenacity and getting the deal more damage to low health enemy champions. Because you're taking Sorcery in the primary, the secondary tree, you can't take Sorcery again, obviously, so you gotta take something else. And I honestly think that the minor runes are just better in the Precision tree than they are in all of the others for Lee Sin. But again, that's up in the air, so don't, you know, you're gonna have to do some experimenting with that. But if you did want to copy what I do, this is what I would do for my Summon Aerie tree for Lee Sin. But again, this tree, this is probably the most interesting for me. I do think that it's good and I think it's viable, but I just think Electrocute does the same thing but better. I just think Electrocute has more reliable burst damage when you need it in those critical moments where you're in a duel in the jungle, and if you get the kill, then you can snowball the game, and if you die, then it really screws over your early game. So I don't want to recommend this tree to you because I really want to recommend Electrocute because I think it does the same thing but better. But at the same time, I do recognize that there is some sort of extra value in Summon Aerie. So if you want to try this page out, it's here for you, but I just don't think that there's many situations where this would be the best option. So that does wrap up my rune suggestions for Lee Sin, all the possible runes that you can take. Just to reiterate, Electrocute Lee Sin is definitely the best, so if you're not sure, that's the one to take. And that's all I really wanted to talk about today. I know this video was kind of mundane, maybe a little bit boring, but I feel like there's just been so much I've been throwing at you in terms of runes that I just needed a nice video to just sum it all up and package it nicely for something that you guys can digest and apply to your rune pages if you want to try out my ideas. That is the end of today's video. I will be following up this video with an actual Lee Sin guide for Season 8 closer to the beginning of the season, so look out for that. But until next time, guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you later.
Dreams, but so many scared to drown. I pull up in a gold tux just to show that I don't fuck around. I'll come through in a gold tux. I'll pull up with my brim low, young boy.